I will make a judgment on man's fitness to exist.
I just want somebody in the world to take me cereal just for once.
Hello, I'm back with yet another Endwalker character analysis. This time we are rounding off the three major ancients by discussing Hermes, the black sheep of the ancients. This video is going to be a 3-in-1 deal since we'll be talking about Hermes, Meteion and Amon. Those of you who watch my previous content know I like to discuss characters that are related to the actual character the video is focused around, and this one is no exception. Even though it does make it a bit longer, I decided to include talks of how Meteion and Amon relate to Hermes. But first, before we get into in-depth discussions about Hermes, we should begin by talking about how we reached that point, that is to say, the character in the lead up to Endwalker.
Hey guys, it's me, Flying Gorilla, from my
It
new
can't
app
be.
on the App Store, Flying Gorilla.
Now, this Fandaniel dude started being set up since 5.1, though he's basically a background villain until 5.4, where he literally flies up on the scene accompanied by Lunar Bahamut, starts spouting some nonsense about ending it all and himself, as Lunar Bahamut blasts some fools for him, and then leaves. I'm being a bit facetious on purpose because I distinctly remember me and many of my friends having a rather lukewarm reception to Fandaniel. The big issue was that Shadowbringer shot up our power levels to such an insane degree that this new threat was quite hard to take seriously. I mean, we clapped 2 entire unsundered Ascians already. What's some random punk Ascian, a sundered one at that, going to do to us at this point? It doesn't help that Fandaniel as a villain is pretty weak and incompetent leading up to Endwalker. It's a bit silly because he actually has some pretty nice aces up his sleeve, in that he makes some pretty smart plans that have been clearly cooking up for a while and starts playing his hand one by one, such as how we forgot to terminate the life support of the Meracidian dragons during our visit into the coils, and then he summons Lunar Bahamut with those dragons still breathing, or how he plans to use Cartano in an unexpected way to cause untold destruction, and of course the mysterious towers that have pretty ingenious defense systems and way of siphoning ether. But of course it doesn't really matter, the warrior flight at this point is simply so overpowered that they always come out on top and saves the day. The story even clearly acknowledges this, as they even start joking about how incompetent Fandaniel is.
Could it be that you're still upset about the dragons?
You are unwise to remind me of so costly a failure.
My plan to redirect the ether from Cartano came to a rather less than satisfactory conclusion. It was, in many respects, an abject failure.
I come to you once more as the bearer of bad news. Our tower in Thavnir has been toppled, and I need not tell you by whom.
Then there was also Fandaniel's whole theatrical personality, which many people weren't a fan of. I mean, the reception was pretty understandable. Shadowbringers left pretty big shoes for the next villain to fill. For one, Emet-Selch was so universally loved by the community, it was difficult to strike gold again like that. And secondly, as I had mentioned previously, the warrior flight and the scions as a whole have become so powerful at this point, it's difficult to make something seem threatening now. I think the writers realized this, which is why they made Fandaniel kind of generic like that. They didn't necessarily want to make a villain that can dethrone Emet, rather they just needed something temporary to have the players focus on until the final days happen. Which is why, conveniently, Fandaniel's sole goal in the story is to facilitate the final days. That's why I don't mind Fandaniel being such a lukewarm villain leading up to the final days. He wasn't really meant to be anything special. He had one purpose, which was to cause the end days, and that was it. At least that's how I see it. Rather, what makes him interesting is what you learn of the man he used to be in Elpis, and then the conclusion to the character afterwards in the Itea scope. In that sense, we do get to see his character arc, it's just that it's played in a reverse order. He reminded me a lot of Auron from FF10 in that regard. a character who had already went through their story by the time the game started, and then you learn throughout the experience what the character went through to shape him up to be what you see in front of you. I was rather intrigued by a part of Fandaniel's character in the lead up to Endwalker. He scoffed Asian sigil, his constellation crystal being broken, as well as Natsuko Ishikawa's comment about him led to some really wild speculation between me and my friends. It was pretty great in that regard, and I would say in retrospect that yes, they did deliver on that. Now, just as with Emet-Selch, this is a character whose story we are shown in two parts. We first get to see what he was like before he was traumatized by things that happened post-sundering, and only afterwards did we learn what the man was like before his fall from grace during the Ancients' time. For this reason, I will proceed the same way as I did in my Emet video, where I'll discuss Fandaniel pre-sundering first, and then get into what he became after the sundering. So of course, we first begin by returning to Elpis, as that's where Hermes is introduced to us. Since Endwalker has already been out for a while, I think a fresh reminder is in order. So I'll just give you guys a quick 60-second recap of his story before we proceed. Alright, you show up in Elpis and Hermes is there. He's very saddened by the fact that he doesn't quite fit in, so he creates the Meteion, beings that can better utilize dynamis, aka undefined emotion power. He sends these birds across the great expanse to seek answers about life. It turns out life kinda sucks all around the universe, and the Twitter birds, or I guess Axe-birds now, get really sad too. Hermes is distraught by all this and went full psycho, during which he makes a trial for mankind's right to exist, but also memory wipes himself and everyone present to make it more fair. He then becomes Fandaniel and is instrumental in developing the Zodiac plan when the first final days hit. The sundering happens and at some point, Amon, the sundered fragment that took after Hermes' original soul, inherits Hermes' memories and goes cray-cray, eventually causing the final days for the second time and all that fun stuff. Right, now that that's out of the way, let's discuss how this part of the story was executed, shall we? We start from his character introduction in Elpis. Hermes is introduced as this pretty chill researcher, a gentle soul the game calls him, which I think accurately sums up the first impression we get of him. We see the dude goofing around, hanging from a tree, and of course the intrigue at this point is seeing and trying to piece together how does this guy turn into the deranged maniac we witnessed bring about the final days. Of course we quickly find out that man's got some issues.
A contradiction so blatant I could scream. Want to scream.
Hermes left a very strong initial impression on me because throughout all of Shadowbringers, I was quite skeptical about how truly perfect the ancient society was, kinda trying to discern the truth from Emmet's rose-tinted nostalgia goggles. I then felt quite vindicated when they showed Hermes, someone who was kind of an error in the system, if you will. In the discussion between Hermes, Hythlo and Emet, we see Hermes really struggling to come to terms with a particular ancient custom wherein people would end their lives once they feel they have accomplished enough and done their duty to the planet. What I love about the composition of this scene is that Hermes is essentially representing what someone from our world would say and how we would react. Hythlodeus is talking about how beautiful dying in this way is, yet Hermes has a very humane response, something I could definitely see saying myself. Think about being in his shoes. You have this person who you've grown a very tight mentor-student bond with over many years, and now he wants to off himself because he's satisfied with his work, and you are supposed to accept it and just smile and move on? Yeah, no, I don't think I will, thank you very much. And what further adds context to his response is that in your visit to Elpis, you'll pretty quickly realize that Hermes has a lot of beef with their society, and it seems almost all, if not all of it, is completely unresolved. We get more of this shortly afterwards when we are presented with yet another issue that Hermes has with his society.
Tell me, do you think it right that we sacrifice all these lives for the sake of the star?
Hermes' argument is essentially, how can we know if we deserve to be here any more than our creations? It's quite a reasonable argument, and one I'm sure many people could get behind. Well, at least initially. I say initially because later on, he of course goes completely off the rails and takes this reasoning to its extreme. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. We also find out that Hermes is suffering from a kind of a severe case of depression. And I'm not talking about depression in the meme way people on the internet use it, or, oh, I'm upset because I stubbed my toe. I mean that he is suffering from an actual depressive disorder of some sort. Now, where this depression stems from exactly, it's a bit hard to say. Maybe it was always there, but there's one thing that stood out to me that definitely made his condition worse: toxic positivity. Granted, it might just be me being drawn to it because of relevancy, with toxic positivity manifesting itself quite a lot in today's society, such as through these online communities that enforce this bubble of positivity, you know, the whole good vibes only. So I'm not sure if it's an intentional social commentary type of a thing, or I'm just reading into it, but regardless, that is my interpretation. I'm sure many of you have heard the term, but to refresh on the definition of toxic positivity, it refers to the push for a mental state in which we only experience and show positive emotions. I think this can definitely be seen in the case of Hermes. See, the ancients live in an ideal world, a paradise, and they aspire for perfection. Naturally, this kind of a society would generally focus on a lot of positivity. After all, there are no plagues, no wars, no corruption, no people killing each other over something pointless. In other words, there simply isn't a whole lot of sadness to go around. Therefore, with the absence of sadness, they decide to focus on positivity more or less exclusively. But Hermes, through his time as chief overseer of the creations in Elpis, his heart slowly turned dark because of his perceived injustices in regards to how the ancients treated their creations.
We did get a lot of feedback about the low polygon grapes in Final Fantasy XIV, so the first thing we did is we went in and checked the grape quality in Final Fantasy XVI and made sure that it was perfect. I looked at it, it's like, yeah, this is not going to be good enough. We need to, raise the polygons on those grapes, so.
Tell me, do you think it right that we sacrifice all these lives for the sake of the star? And when the star has reached perfection, what then? If all who are satisfied choose to die, shall we all die in satisfaction?
This is when that bubble of positivity bursted for Hermes, and as a result, he sort of became a glitch in the system. He was now someone with a lot more sadness than was typical for the ancients, but within a society that wasn't necessarily best suited for dealing with that level of grief. And so, when Hermes started developing those darker thoughts, he found himself inadequate to deal with them. He felt as if he couldn't talk to anyone about it, nor could he process them internally in any way. This can already be seen in the aforementioned scene where Hermes talks about his mentor stepping down. Hythlodaeus' response, while understandable from an ancient society perspective, isn't actually helping Hermes whatsoever. Hermes is distraught that someone close to him will soon die of their own volition, and Hythlodaeus basically goes on to explain to Hermes how this is actually a good thing, and he should think about the beauty of the situation and how great and wonderful it is. He even expresses shock at a word with such a strong negative connotation as die being used, and immediately moves away from it. The issue here is that neither Hythlo nor Emet are acknowledging Hermes' feelings, his sadness, here. They instead basically just try to reframe his way of looking at the situation to be more positive. The big issue with toxic positivity is that you eventually start feeling shitty and ashamed when you are feeling negative emotions. You've convinced yourself that as long as you keep up the good vibes, it's going to be all good. And so, over time, Hermes would come to associate his sadness with something shameful, hence he never addressed it and tried to ignore it. And we definitely see this on full display. He's always very apprehensive about the topic. This creates a big problem. If you have reached a point where you believe that you're not allowed to think negatively, it can lead to you suppressing emotions that are real, causing those emotions to show themselves in other ways, like becoming anxious or depressed. And this is exactly what happened to Hermes. And so, this led to the slew of symptoms we see him suffering from in the game, being ashamed for having negative emotions, inability to share his true feelings, constantly hiding how he genuinely feels, and so on. But who is to blame here? Is this the fault of the ancients and the way their society operates? This is where it gets a bit tricky. I personally don't think so, or at the very least it's not solely their fault. Something FF14 teaches us is that no matter how good they look on the surface, every type of society has its flaws and its demons, even the utopian pre-sundered world. If you do the side quests in Elpis, you'll find out how the other researchers treat their creations, and you can see that some do treat them with respect and from a place of genuine compassion. Some also have doubts, similar to Hermes. This really adds to Hermes' story because you realize through those side quests that if he had just tried talking to the other researchers more and better understand what they enjoy about their work, gain those perspectives, I think that could have been helpful to Hermes. I'm also quite certain that the Amarotane society does have methods by which they can help relieve stress. We also saw during Shadowbringers, during our visit into the Phantom Amarot, that a huge portion of their culture revolved around debating philosophical questions. Perhaps it could have benefited Hermes a lot to just take a vacation to the capital and engage in these deeper discussions about life and their society. But of course, those who have suffered from depression know that it can reach a point where it becomes debilitating. As in, your depression is so crippling that to think of a way to treat it is not even a feasible thought. It's more about plain survival at that point, when even getting up from bed can be extremely challenging because you feel so worthless and may even have self-destructive thoughts. I think that's the kind of downward spiral Hermes was heading towards. He was so crippled that he simply could not and would not seek aid or do any of the above suggestions I laid out. Because sure, he must have thought of talking about his issues. Hell, it's probably on his mind, gnawing at him every single second that he's awake. But he would have felt such great shame and anxiety that the barrier he had to overcome to actually initiate a conversation with anyone about this was so enormous, it was pretty much impossible. And that is of course until the warrior of light enters the picture.
You're not the only one, Hermes. Others feel sad too. Go on.
He needs to stop being sad. When I get sad, I stop being sad and be awesome instead.
I thank you.
They make for a perfect candidate for Hermes to talk to, being an outsider. We see in that scene where the warrior of light turns the Elpis flowers purple, Hermes immediately leaps on the opportunity to talk about his issues and starts opening up, and you can really see how relieved he is after letting all that off his chest. For your character, it's a pretty minor interaction, but for Hermes, it's one of the biggest conversations of his entire life. Finally, he could actually talk about his problems without feeling guilt or shame. You've basically lifted an entire mountain's worth of weight off him, and they really nail that scene. It invokes a lot of emotion. This also explains his motive to seek out life from other stars. He felt he couldn't talk to anyone about his problems in his own society, so of course he would desperately look for any kind of interaction from outside of it. And this interaction with the warrior of light probably only served to deepen that desire. It must have been like a drug to him, like holy shit, I can actually talk to someone about my problems? I need more of this. But of course the issue with this is that he proceeded with such zeal that he lost sight of what it is to be a scientist. But that is something I'll be discussing in the Meteion chapter. Anyway, we've discussed what the problem with this guy is, but what, dear viewer, did he do about it?
I will make a judgment on man's fitness to exist.
Genocide. Yep, he chose genocide to solve his problems. I'm really starting to sense a theme with these ancients that we have been discussing lately. They seem quite trigger happy on the whole genocide to solve my issues thing. In a way, I'm glad there are no more ancients around in the world. I'd be pretty terrified of an ancient walking into a store and their favorite brand of cereal is out of stock, cue the ancient in question getting upset and going on a little genocidal streak. Right, you guys know the deal by now. It's another crazy ancient decides to genocide everyone, and now we need to discuss this from all the possible angles segment. There are a lot of opinions on how well was Hermes' turn the villain he executed in the story, so I want to delve into some of that here. On one hand, I've heard his shift was too sudden, and I can definitely see where this is coming from. While what we got was enough for me personally, I do feel like the LP segment suffers from being a bit ambitious. It simply has to cover way too much within the span of like 3 levels. You have the lead up with Elidibus, then you have all the moments featuring Emet-Selch and Hythlodaeus, then you have the fact that this entire zone had to introduce and develop the entirety of Vena as a character, it had to develop Meteion, it had to develop the entire conflict which the game revolves around, have a symbolic montage sequence with Vena's walk, squeeze in a solo instance and a dungeon somewhere in there, throw in some lore bombs, introduce a new type of energy, time travel, amnesia memes, oh, and they had to also sprinkle in some good old fan service throughout. A shit ton of fan service. All this on top of having to develop Hermes as a character and his shift to becoming an antagonist. The result is what we see in the game. Hermes just doesn't get too many scenes, and his story in this segment, especially his downturn, is quite compact. So I do think saying he didn't get enough screen time is a fair critique. I definitely wished we had gotten to spend a bit more time with Hermes and Meteion. However, I'm not sure if I agree with his transformation being too sudden. We actually see him hesitate a few times after hearing Meteion's report. Initially, he seemed to be on board with listening to Emet-Selch, but then hesitated and changed his mind last second. Then he did a bit of an oopsie with going as far as to transform and abusing his position of power within Kithisis Hyperborea by rigging the building's defenses to his advantage. We then see that after his defeat, he is content with giving it up. He pretty much realizes he went a bit too far, and I'm sure Vena, Emet-Selch, Hythlo, and the warrior flight beating the crap out of him brought some sense into him. However, when you have someone distressed and kind of on the edge like Hermes is here, it can only take a few words or a very minor thing to tip the scales and cause them to snap. And that's exactly what happens.
Who are you to decide our fate? To decree we live or die?
This singular line by Emet-Selch is the straw that broke the camel's back, if you will. The reason this line is so devastating to Hermes is that all this time it has been gnawing at him how, in his mind, the ancients treat their creation so callously and without caring if they should be allowed to live.
Creations that he deems useless are discarded with nary a second thought. Some scarcely born into the world, afforded a handful of breaths before life and potential are abruptly extinguished. Tell me, do you think it right that we sacrifice all these lives for the sake of the star?
His entire argument was based on the very question that Emet-Selch uses to completely dismiss what Meteion is saying. And you can definitely tell by Hermes' facial expression during this moment. That is when he goes off the deep end. I sometimes hear people say how stupid Hermes' trial to mankind is, how it runs contrary to his love for those creations, since Meteion would kill all life on the star, how much of an idiot he is for pitting mankind in a trial against an enemy they wouldn't have any clue even exists, and comments like that. But I think comments like these, viewing Hermes' determination from a rational/logical perspective, while I think it's fun to explore and dunk on him, which we'll be doing later as well, it really is missing the point though. It's obvious the man has went into some kind of a psychosis here. He's most definitely not thinking straight. I think Hermes' story has been precisely building up to this point. The man has battled with his depression all this time, and at this point, he's had such a string of shitty things coming to him in a succession between Meteion's report and Emet-Selch's words, he just doesn't give a crap at this point and loses his grip with all sense of reality. This is exactly the kind of state in which most people become suicidal, but because Hermes is an ancient and in a position of a lot of power, he can direct his energy at the world instead. Remember in my Vena episode how I spoke about a fundamental flaw in the ancient society, about how powerful the ancients are, how even just one individual can cause so much damage. Yeah, we are about to see that play out again. Granted, you could say it's kind of weak for the inciting incident to involve the bad guy going crazy. Oh, he's just insane. But I suppose whether him being driven to madness was well executed or not is up for you to determine.
Stay down on the ground! Stay down on the ground, you motherfucker!
Oh, but it gets worse. Emmet then follows up with this.
If we ourselves are flawed, does it not stand to reason that we too should be discarded?
That is sophistry, and you know it!
With this line, Emet-Selch pretty much manages to plunge Hermes deeper into insanity during his little outburst. Why would this sentence trigger Hermes? Well, let's consider Hermes' view of Elpis. Despite being the guy in charge of this place, he doesn't actually believe in the goal of Elpis, of slowly creating a perfect world through perfecting these creations in nature. In a private conversation with him, we find out that he actually finds this whole concept repulsive. He finds it to be sophistry and a load of rubbish. So when Emmet calls his own act an act of sophistry, in his mind, that just fuels his negative connotations about the ancients, about their hypocrisy and so on, and causes him to go even deeper into rage. What I also like about this interaction between Emet-Selch and Hermes is that, I mentioned in the earlier scene, Hermes was sort of a stand-in for the player, reacting how the player might feasibly react with our understanding of our culture versus that of the ancients. They do something fun here, which is they sort of flip that whole thing on its head. In this scene, Hermes is the one spouting drivel, and this time Emet-Selch is being used as the character that most players can easily side with when he calls out Hermes on his actions. In essence, the story acknowledges the absurdity of Hermes' little trial and calls him out on it through Emet-Selch. So, don't get me wrong, I'm definitely not insinuating that Emet-Selch was in any way at fault for all of this, for triggering Hermes. In fact, he's pretty based for doing so. Hell yeah. I also appreciate that they used an actual character to dismantle Hermes' argument instead of using random nobodies as strawmen like was the case with a certain other character. I bring this up because something we have to keep in mind about this scene is it should not be misunderstood as the developers expecting the players to agree with Hermes here. At the beginning of this segment, I mentioned that Hermes' argument was quite sound for the most part and one that most people could sympathize with, but that all goes out of the window in this scene. What I very much took from all three major ancients is that they all had good arguments, their feelings made sense given their environment and personality, and they all had reasonable philosophies. But the issue with all three of them is that they took their ideologies to the extreme, and I think this was very much deliberate. To have the player start out with, oh yeah, that makes sense, and then when they do their big idiotic thing, you'd be like, well, that's kind of crossing the line, don't you think? Though, obviously the writer wants the players to draw their own conclusions, but what I mean is that, and I hate I'm having to even spell this out, they aren't trying to make you think that Hermes' whole genocide shtick is something to admire or sympathize with. Rather, I think it's made very clear it's simply an act of lunacy. Now, besides Emet-Selch, another character that reacts to Meteion's report is of course Venar. When faced with the news that there's basically no life at all in the vast universe, the two, Hermes and Venar, reacted quite differently. Even though Venar initially despairs at the contents of the report, she does have the time to process it and does come to terms with it, and eventually draw her own conclusions from it. Very unlike Hermes, who immediately leaped onto the despair train, rather than maybe get a good night's sleep and think it over. Then again, I feel as if most people, even rational ones, might struggle with taking a step back and deliberating when presented with such devastating, life-changing information, as it's often all too easy to be impulsive when faced with such difficult situations. Their reactions are also rather logical, given their worldviews. Venar accepted life as being a miracle, a happenstance, whereas Hermes / Amon insisted on there being an answer, a meaning to all of it, a singular, specific answer to his question. So when the answer of the Meteion was, well, there is no meaning and we should just delete everything, It devastated Hermes because he couldn't get that answer he wanted. Whereas for Vena, these news weren't really a problem, seeing as she had already affirmed in her mind what life is. There is a clear difference here between the response of a man whose mind is teetering at knife's edge and someone who is very well adjusted mentally and has formed a strong worldview of her own. Alright, we've now discussed Hermes' turn to villainy, but how much of a bad guy was Hermes in the end? Okay, I know what you're thinking. Oh shit, is this going to be another one of those he did nothing wrong type of videos? Well, you're just going to have to keep watching to find out. So, first off, I want to get into Hermes' role in the FF14 story. I established in the previous two videos how Emet-Selch is a bad guy some people see as good or justified, whereas Vena is a good guy some people see as bad or not justified in her actions, but that ultimately the role of Emet-Selch is to be the villain and Vena to be a hero of sorts because of how the story is structured and from whose POV it is told. Though I would like to put out a disclaimer that doesn't mean there can't be nuance and that you necessarily need to agree with it based on morals, so I still very much implore people to make up their own opinions, as do the writers. Hermes, however, is an interesting case. When asking, is Hermes a bad guy in the story, I am sure I'll get some mixed responses and strong reactions to this question. I think it's an interesting topic to explore, so I want to provide some of the ways I'd look at it, and also look at what was most likely the writer's intent. Personally, I do consider Hermes to be an antagonist, but not the main villain of the expansion. But who is then? This is a topic that seems to garner discussion surrounding Endwalker, this question of who is responsible for causing this conflict, who's the big bad of the story. There are essentially four antagonists throughout the story: Fandaniel, Zenos, Hermes and Meteion. Now, just to be clear, and to be consistent with the pragmatic type of logic I used to describe Emet-Selch as a villain, yes, I do believe that all of the above entities are antagonists, including Hermes and Meteion / the Endsinger, because they directly oppose you in the story. But the bigger question is, who is the big bad here? Who's responsible? This is a technical topic to cover because none of them make for the definitive big bad in the same way that, say, Emet-Selch did in Shadowbringers. I bring this up because the lack of a clear villain in Endwalker has also caused some people to compare one of the aforementioned characters to Emet-Selch as villains, which I think is a faulty comparison. They aren't the villains of their respective stories and shouldn't be compared as such. Fandaniel / Amon is the guy pretty much instigating all the events leading up to the final days, but he dies off about 1/3 of the way through the story, excluding his brief appearance in the idea scope. Zenos too seems to be the final opponent we were building up to, but likewise drops off in relevance after we defeat Zodiac. He does return later, but it's hard to quantify him as a villain at that point since he's actually helping you. He could be said to be the final boss of the story, though I debate this take in my Zenos fight video, but even then that fight is more of a bonus, as stated by the developers themselves. It's interesting that I have seen people refer to Zenos as the real final boss. The developers on the other hand had this to say, coming from Mr. Yoshida. They were worried about how to handle Zenos. He's the only one who sees the warrior fight as an adventure and not just a hero, so the fight is more of an extra than a final boss. Meteion, aka the Endsinger, is what I personally argue to be the final boss of the story, so you could say that her, being the final obstacle for our hero to overcome, is the big bad. Yet that doesn't exactly sit right because Meteion is essentially just a program intended to do what her architect intended her to do. And this brings us to Hermes, the guy who set up pretty much every single event in the game in motion, causing the initial and subsequently the second final days, as well as birthing Meteion / the Endsinger. Since every bad thing that happens in the game can be traced back to his antagonistic actions at the end of Kitti's Hyperborea, does that make Hermes ultimately the villain of Endwalker? Well, yesn't. What complicates this is that Hermes isn't actually the final boss. You pretty much defeat him 2/3 of the way through the game. He also essentially stops, in quotations, being an antagonist right after the events of Kitti's Hyperborea because he wipes his memory, and also because of the sundering, he basically does not reappear in the story again. It's complicated even more if we consider the final boss, the Endsinger, a direct consequence of his actions. So in that sense, there is a way of considering him to still be the big bad after his defeat, because he's still basically the mastermind and you're left to deal with the crap that he left behind. You could make a similar argument with some FF titles, because in quite a few, they have a situation where the puppet master type of a villain is undone by the puppet, who then becomes the real bad guy, yet you could argue them being the bad guy is a direct result of that mastermind villain. But even that line of thinking is hard to subscribe to when discussing Endwalker, mainly because no one is really in charge at that point. Meteion is just a directive and Hermes is no longer around to direct it in any way. Not that he could even if he was. The Meteor are just a force of nature that exists at that point, something purely symbolic to represent despair. Instead, I think the main opposing antagonistic force of Endwalker is no single character, but rather the abstract concept of despair. Of course, I don't think I'm giving you guys some huge revelation when I say this, it's actually a pretty common interpretation of the story, as it should be, seeing as I think that was very much the intention. But I do think it's an interesting choice, as it can always present its own challenges to not have a clear villainous character that acts as the hero's obstacle to overcome. And there are certainly discussions to be had about this decision in my hopefully eventual Endwalker analysis, since Endwalker tries to get around this by pretty much beating the whole overcoming despair theme into your head with a bloody sledgehammer. I should also note that it's something that commonly happens in JRPGs, and indeed, there are other titles in the series that went for the same idea of having the final boss be purely symbolic to represent something abstract like anger, death, despair, or whatnot. You know, the moment when you're fighting what you thought was the final boss, the main villain of the game, and then comes out this god who is all like, screw humanity, I'm here to kill you all. Only in Endwalker it was built up a bit more than that, through Meteion. Now, we've discussed Hermes' villainy from a narrative perspective, but what about judging his morality? Ooh boy, this is gonna be a spicy one too, isn't it?
Nope.
So, were it to come down to a moral argument, obviously most people would say, yeah, he was a pretty bad dude, with probably a good chunk of people even proclaiming him the most evil mofo in all of existence. But funnily enough, just as with Emet, I've seen the forming of a small amount of players being all like, Hermes did nothing wrong, which I find quite funny. Now, I'm being facetious, of course no one would say it literally in those words, more just insinuating that kind of a thought is what I'm getting at. Anyway, I mentioned in the Vena analysis that I would like to discuss the Omega quest line again. That's because there's some interesting things to discuss when it came to how people responded to the who was justified question, when it came to Hermes in particular. So I had a look at two separate polls I could find for how people responded to that question, and though they aren't the biggest sample sizes, I think they are more than sufficient for this. Also, with this kind of stuff, the community that these kinds of polls are made on /for are always bound to influence the responses, so bear that in mind. Something that also makes this a little more technical is that there is the "they were all justified" option, which about half the people voting went for. That would basically tell us that half the people figured Hermes was justified. However, I'm simply going to ignore this option. I would assume that a good chunk went for this as kind of the default option. It's the easiest one to pick as a knee-jerk reaction without much further thought, and I also find the way the response is phrased a bit silly. They were all justified in their own way. Meaning what? One easy interpretation for this way of phrasing would be that they all felt justified from their own perspective. But that's like giga obvious. I mean, if you could not justify the decision for yourself in that moment, you would have not made that decision in the first place. Of course, I'm just making big assumptions here, but for these reasons I kinda want to simply ignore the "they were all justified" answer and instead purely focus on the people that chose a specific person rather than all or none, because I think that's where you get some interesting discussion. So when we exclude the all and none answers and only look at the people that specifically went for one of the three individuals, the split in one poll was 55% went for Vena, 36% for Emet, and 9% for Hermes. And in the other poll, we had a split of 70% Vena, 26% Emet, and 4% Hermes. the results are hardly surprising. Vena getting the most makes sense, since she's the only one of the three that is not an antagonist. Emet-Selch makes sense as well, since he had the most screen time to develop sympathy for him. And then there's Hermes with those abysmal numbers. I would say the two biggest reasons are Hermes' lack of screen time compared to the other two, as well as his plight requiring a bit more of a specific type of a person to relate to. That may not yet make much sense at the moment, but I'll be elaborating on that more towards the end of the analysis. Yet, those are kind of boring reasons, so let's take a look at Hermes' actions from an ethics point of view. Now, there is one normative ethical system that, if stripped to its purest form, would justify Hermes' actions, which is consequentialism. Of course, I don't want to turn this video into a philosophy class, so I'm not going too ham into all the facets of consequentialism, but luckily I don't need to, because the game itself provides this perspective. If the survival of your kind is the deciding factor in your evaluation, then should you not also admire Hermes and his decision to subject man to a trial, forcing you to change or perish, as was the fate of countless civilizations before you? This dialogue is brought by Omega in the optional 6.15 questline. Omega, being a machine, holds this very classic and pure form of consequentialism, which is basically good outcome equals justified. But the reason most people cannot see Hermes' actions as justified, even if their ethics are based on outcomes of actions, is that consequentialism in its modern form emphasizes the intended outcome of actions. This is because it's impossible to predict the outcomes of our actions. Sometimes good intent results in a bad outcome, and sometimes bad intention leads to a good outcome. Therefore, it's much more sensible to separate intent from the actual result of our actions. So a consequentialist that holds this kind of a modern view wouldn't look at it from the angle of did the end justify the means, but rather such devastation, but was that his intention? So even a modern consequentialist would still likely judge the morality of Hermes' actions quite harshly. Because I don't know about you, but I personally don't believe at all he aimed for this kind of an outcome. Sure, his whole spiel in Kitty's Hyperborea is about subjecting mankind to a test and seeing if he survives, but I don't buy for a second that he's doing it out of some desire to better the human race or engineering stronger individuals. I get the feeling he's doing what he's doing out of pure spite and contempt in that moment. But I suppose if you're a hardcore consequentialist like Omega, you would see Hermes' actions as justified, since you may be coming at this from the viewpoint of an outcome is an outcome. But as I stated, most people, even consequentialists, don't view it that way. And even if you did, I'd imagine those people wouldn't be so black and white about it as to not acknowledge that a line was indeed crossed somewhere, most likely at the whole committing genocide part. Okay, so we've spent quite a great deal discussing Hermes so far, but we shouldn't forget that there is another character we should be discussing, someone integral to his story, a certain type of a bird. No, not that one, I meant this one.
Look everyone, I made a spacefaring probe that is looking for the meaning of life in the cold, dark universe.
You fucked up a perfectly good bird is what you did, Hermes. Look at it. It has depression.
Okay, I'm normally not in the habit of using other people's memes, as I rather homebrew my own with my limited editing skills, but I simply couldn't resist yoinking this one. It's simply too great to not slip in a video about Hermes. Alright, back to serious content. Meteion is an interesting character. On one hand, she's just an extension of Hermes, but on the other, she kind of is her own character as well. This is because the story basically presents to us two entities that are both called Meteion. We have the Meteion, the hive mind that fell to despair, who started firing the depression beam and formed the Endsinger, and then we have Meteion, the singular Meteion we meet in Elpis and again in Ultima Thule. It is that Meteion which we have a personal attachment to, so that's what I'll be discussing primarily. Naoki Yoshida had said that they had expected the like to dislike ratio between Hermes and Meteion to be closer, but it ended up being something like 90% liking Meteion over Hermes. But personally, I find that this makes sense with the way the story was laid out. After all, Hermes is the architect, and he fucked up big time when he created Meteion, which I'll get more into in the next bit. She was the victim of an awful creation, which is of course meant to be ironic, since Hermes did what he despised about the ancients and did it infinitely worse, causing way more pain to Meteion than any of the ancients did to any of their creations. It's easy to feel empathy for her, and I admit to once again tearing up when revisiting some of her scenes for this video. Meteion is also legitimately a funny character. I got a good smile out of some of those strange moments with her at the start of Elpis, and the exchange between her and Emet-Selch will never stop being hilarious.
No, no, no. You are not foisting this nonsense on me.
Or else Hermes will transform. Right now. Please, Emet-Selch. Please.
Look, I'm a simple man. If your character can make me cry and laugh and all that fun stuff, then you've succeeded in my books. Now, despite being heavily tied to Hermes' character, Meteion herself is her own character and surprisingly fleshed out, given how little time we got to spend with her. This kind of a character could easily have been a simple plot device and a simple faceless tool made by Hermes that we barely interact with, that causes the final days and all that, which is what the Meteion are, essentially. They don't really have any value to us, beyond setting up the plot and being the big final bad for us to beat down, as in there is no personal connection there, but the writers most likely felt it was crucial we develop a bond with that one Meteion that we meet in Elpis, so that they can then have a big payoff at the end of the story. The first one happens once you reach the Meteion nest after all your friends have sacrificed themselves, and with the aid of Hytlo and Emet, you summon a bunch of Elpis flowers. This is among my favorite moments in Ultima 2, if not my favorite. The camera work, the music, the voice acting, everything about this scene is just incredible, and it delivers some really good emotional damage if you were even slightly invested in Meteion's story. Seeing this childlike empath character receive compassion and hope for the first time in thousands of years, I mean, yeah, it's some pretty powerful stuff, right? This is basically that crucial moment where, after a long and grueling uphill battle against despair, the heroes have finally won thematically and ideologically, and that winning blow is delivered with those Elpis flowers as Meteion, the embodiment of despair, falls to her knees in defeat. Everything from this point onwards is basically giving the player a final dungeon and a final boss because A, it's a video game and we still need to smack shit, but let's be real, that scene was the moment we won the game. You then defeat the end singer and get that final scene with Meteion.
What they live for. What gives their lives meaning. There was never a single answer. You gather pieces of happiness, precious and fragile, only to lose them. Then start again. That which Hermes sent us to find was there all this time. On Atheris.
She finally understands what gives your life meaning, uses the abundance of dynamis to sing a song of hope, and turns back to blue. This is a continuation of that payoff I was mentioning. By making Meteion an actual character we got attached to back in Elpis, our triumph over despair is given a tangible human form with Meteion, so that final victory feels really satisfying and emotional. This was also the only other time they played the full vocal version of Flow, aside from Heidelin's death, and it definitely deserves to be played here, such an amazing scene. It's also synced here, unlike in the Heidelin scene, which is great. Overall, I thought Meteion was a fun character, and even though I felt they had her spam the whole nihilism angle maybe a bit too much at times in Ultima 2, the whole thing still came around at the end with that payoff. This is something I had an issue with in general with the Endwalker story, but it's something I'll discuss more in my actual Endwalker analysis. Her voice actress also did a great job doing the different voices between the awkward and bubbly Meteion, the monotone robotic voice she uses when conveying messages from the hive mind, as well as the emo bird voice. Meteion also has a lot of potential as a character in the future, assuming of course that they decide to bring her back. Her fate is a bit unclear because there's no clear signs of her actually dying, despite her calling you her final encounter. It's just that she does not reappear in the story afterwards, nor is even mentioned, aside from that starbird flying in Mordona at the end, which could just be symbolic anyway, though if interpreted literally, it would suggest Meteion is out there, discovering the world of Etheris similar to Alpha and Omega. A fun way to reintroduce her could be in a storyline featuring those two, or maybe a future member of your party, who knows. And honestly, there's no real reason to assume she died or anything. I mean, surely they'd have given her an actual death scene if that was the case. I think it's quite clear she's still out there. Right, that was an entire segment without dunking on Hermes, so let us turn our attention to him once again, so that we can all point and laugh at his failure, discuss his character thoroughly. I mentioned earlier that Hermes proceeded with the Meteion project with such zeal that he lost sight of what it is to be a scientist. In this segment, I'll be trying to elaborate on that point. Yes, we discussed why Hermes was kinda loco, and that may or may not justify his actions in your eyes, but regardless, let's look at the outcomes of his actions and rip into them. So yeah, Hermes' biggest fuck up was Meteion, there's no doubt about it. He messed up on so many accounts. Let's get down to listing them. Now, keep in mind these are the things that came to mind at the time of writing this video, but there are probably more ways he screwed up still. And just as a disclaimer, the points brought in this segment aren't about why he did those things, as I already covered that in an earlier segment. This is more just listing all the stupidity that was caused by Hermes in his poor mental state, because it's fun to go through all of it. Obviously, it would be kinda low to dunk on a mentally unstable person, but since this is a fictional character, surely I won't get in trouble for this, right? Okay, so for the list. Number 1. Ethical. What he subjected Meteion to is downright cruel. We get a pretty good look at this in the side story featuring Hermes, where dozens of Meteor had to die in some pretty awful ways before they could be successfully sent to investigate other stars. But this is made even worse by Meteion's empathic nature, where every time one of her sisters died, it had a huge toll on her mental health, which we also see play out in the side story. And Hermes basically doesn't seem to give much of a crap about this in said side story, but what he does in the actual game is even worse. He subjected Meteion to an awful existence out of pure indulgence on his part. Not only does this make him an incredible hypocrite, it's also very unethical, and this is exactly why we have boards of ethics in real life, so that we don't have nutjobs like Hermes doing whatever they want for the sake of their bullshit science. Number 2. No peer review. The Meteion case demonstrates quite nicely as to why peer reviewing is crucial in any field. I mean, if Hermes had approached his colleagues about this project, I am sure they could have provided him with input that would have mitigated the damage caused by the project, if not salvaged it altogether. Things such as maybe limiting the amount of media sent out at any one time, phrasing the question slightly better, implementing safety features such as temporarily disabling a sister who is under too much emotional distress, having a hard cap on how much dynamics they can manipulate, efforts to make the hive mind more stable. I could keep going on and on. Point is, more sets of eyes can spot flaws better than just one person, so don't be a dunce like Hermes and actually have serious works peer-reviewed. Number 3. Abusing his position of authority as chief overseer. When you elect someone to be in power, the last thing you want is for them to start taking advantage of their position of power. Well, that is exactly what Hermes did. He abused his authority when he bypassed the peer-reviewing process, but the worst offender is that he ignored every single protocol set in place by the society when it comes to releasing concepts into existence. He went through exactly 0 of the normal procedures to get concepts approved. Sure, this kind of bureaucracy may seem a bit mundane, but there is a reason they are in place. And keep in mind that the ancient society seems to place immense value in this process, as we learn in the side quests in Amaroth, which makes this crime even worse. Although if you really want to get me on a technicality, you could argue that Hermes did not release anything into the world, but rather out into the universe, so I don't know if the ancients have any regulations on that. Either way, my point is, he abused his position as a trusted figure to satisfy his own desire, which is a big no-no. Now, somewhat related to this topic, I would also note that Hermes wasn't a very good leader with how he viewed his subordinates with contempt, and pretty much refuse to see anything good in their work. Number 4. No skepticism applied whatsoever. So there's this little thing called scientific method, right? Let me list one crucial aspect of this, straight from the Wikipedia article for the scientific method. It involves careful observation, applying rigorous skepticism about what is observed, given that cognitive assumptions can distort how one interprets the observation. Basically that once you make a hypothesis, you try to find not just things that confirm said hypothesis, but also things that could debunk it. This is an absolute must, since otherwise you fall victim to confirmation bias and arrive at faulty conclusions. This is exactly what happened to Hermes when going through with the Meteion experiment. His mind subconsciously protected him from the possibility that life could be worse elsewhere, and so he wanted to believe, in sheer desperation, that surely people elsewhere are not suffering as much as he is. Even though I don't have that much of a scientific mind, something that I always have seen as important when wanting to seek out the truth in something is being able to get out of your comfort zone and actually challenge your views. In this sense, Hermes is basically an antithesis of an individual like Alphino, someone who, throughout the course of the game, has developed a strong ability to challenge his worldviews. Sophistry. Emet-Selch accuses Hermes of sophistry, and rightly so. As per the modern usage of the word, his argument is one that's made to appear sound on the surface, but doesn't hold up to scrutiny when looked at more critically. Hermes' premise here is that because the ancients test to see if their creations are flawed and whether they have the right to exist, that they too should be subject to such a test to see if they are flawed and whether they have the right to exist. Okay, that makes sense somewhat, even if it's a little silly, but the means by which Hermes attempts to carry out this trial is completely illogical because he's using the Meteia to conduct it. There are so many problems with this. First of all, the goal of the Meteia isn't to make some sort of a rational judgment on mankind's right to exist. They don't give two fucks about that. They now exist for the sole purpose of ending all life in the universe. What's worse, in an effort to make it more fair, he actually makes the test even dumber, because by not even knowing of its existence, how in the world is mankind meant to be standing up to the depression being caused by the Meteia and ultimately defeat the Endsinger? And even if Hermes were to argue that, oh well, whether a civilization survives contact with Meteion makes for a good methodology of determining their right to exist, which is just asinine, but okay, let's actually go with it. What about the fact that there were instances of planets which were fine prior to the arrival of the Meteia that were driven to their extinction directly by Meteion's actions? Because she kept pestering them incessantly with the question and giving them non-stop depression energy due to them being in a feedback loop of creating more and more despair due to Hermes' shitty design. So yeah, let's test mankind's right to exist by using a method that we know invariably leads to a total extinction as caused by an entity that exists for the sole purpose of ending all life, not just on Eteris but of all existence. I mean, this is like having access to all the nukes in the world and you decide to use them to destroy the entirety of Earth just out of the blue with no prior notice as a way to see if people could somehow survive it. You aren't conducting a test, mate. You are blowing up the fucking Earth. This is exactly why Emet-Selch calls Hermes out for engaging in sophistry, because his entire argument crumbles when you take even a few seconds to think about it. But the argument isn't necessarily aimed at Emet-Selch, but rather at the player, since of course the writers are trying to make the player buy into it, and the way they attempt this is not through logic, because the writers themselves acknowledge through Emet-Selch that the argument is flawed. Rather, they attempt an emotional buy-in, because we've seen the torment that Hermes has been through. Funnily enough, a big hallmark of sophistry is appealing to emotions in order to strengthen one's argument, using that emotional component to make it appear more sound. So, in a strange fourth wall breaky kind of way, he's engaging in sophistry with us, the player. I just wanted to add that because I thought it was pretty funny. Of course, the reason his argument is weak is that, like I said earlier, he has already snapped at this point and obviously isn't thinking rationally. In fact, deep down, he probably knows himself the argument has no leg to stand on. He's simply going through with it because at that point, he's acting out of pure spite and hatred towards the ancient society. I bring this up because I want to clarify that I am not saying his argument being so fallacious is bad writing. On the contrary, This is exactly why I like Hermes as a character. He does a lot of dumb shit, but we understand why he does it, because it's irrationality caused by the pain he's had to go through. Which is to say that all of this is really a shame, because we can actually see that Hermes is possessed of quite a brilliant mind. First of all, to reach his station as chief overseer is a pretty significant accomplishment, not to mention being nominated for a seat among the convocation of 14. But we can also see this demonstrated in our visit through Elpis. Hermes is rather resourceful and comes up with creative solutions to problems, usually fueled by his compassion towards his creations, such as teaching the Charybdis to fly or creating Kairos to memory wipe creations instead of outright destroying them. He also has this innate curiosity that drives him to do great things. So all in all, Hermes was an excellent scientist, at least he was when he was sane of mind, but when his mental health began taking a nosedive, he lost sight of what it is to be a scientist and acted out of sheer desperation. This adds to his tragedy, since he's a case of great potential resulting in a bad outcome due to unfortunate circumstances. As is the custom in these ancient videos, let's now discuss what became of Hermes after the terrible event that was the Sundering. Now, unlike the other 4 ancients talked about in this series, Hermes didn't escape the Sundering. Despite that, it could still be said that he was a special case, as a part of his unsundered self came to haunt him post-Sundering, which I'll get more into in just a bit. So in this chapter, we'll discuss Amon as well as how he relates to Hermes. Now, Hermes by himself is already a great character, but they chose to go beyond that and add a whole another dimension to him by having us explore 2 sides of this one character, Hermes and Amon. What's awesome about this is that now that I've been using Hermes as a punching bag all this video thus far, we can continue dunking on him, just through Amon this time. Anyway, let us start from the beginning, the guy whose soul Amon would take after. Now, Amon inheriting the soul of Hermes was both a blessing and a curse. The good news about being a fragment of Hermes, you get a golden ticket towards becoming a genius. Sweet, you get to roll a character with 20 int. So, what about the bad news? Well, just about everything else. Yeah, I'm not gonna lie, this deal kinda sucks.
I'll make that deal. How about you, Yudovich? You make that deal?
I'd make that deal.
I don't blame you. Damn good deal.
Let's start with the fact that Fandaniel's soul is fundamentally broken. Much of this stems from the interaction between Kairos' memory alteration and Vena's sundering move. See, Kairos couldn't fully excise the memories that played out in Elpis during your visit. Rather, it simply repressed them the best it could. That means those events and the feelings and memories associated with them, Hermes' anguish, the depressing news that all life sucks in the universe, Hermes going cray-cray and testing mankind's right to exist, they were all imprinted in that soul and never left, and thus were a part of his fragmented soul post-sundering. The result of this? Recurring nightmares. Those who have seen my Zenos video may remember me discussing this point with Zenos, about how having to play out a nightmare over and over would deeply traumatize a person. Now, if that wasn't already bad enough, this comes to haunt him even more later on in his life, when he receives the memories of Fandaniel's constellation crystal, though I'm getting ahead of myself. But just like in his previous life, Amon goes on to find great success through his ingenuity in his research, and he viewed his peers with similar contempt too. The advent of heterochemistry allowed the elegants to create technologies far beyond what was thought imaginable previously. They were able to bend nature to their will, and this made their lives extremely comfortable, as most if not all of life's woes were either mitigated or outright removed by this technology. Many would then find meaning in their lives only by seeking hedonistic pleasures. To quote Grahatia, the Empire's people spoke lightly of death and destruction, experimenting on those they deemed beneath them to feel the emptiness in their hearts. Even though he didn't think too highly of them, seeing his countrymen substituting real purpose for these kinds of pleasures and seeing his empire in decline, Amon sought to give these people the meaning in their lives that they were so sorely lacking. See, Amon was a massive fanboy of their first emperor, Zande, and through countless trial and error, he managed to accomplish something thought to be impossible. He revived the emperor. And as Amon had foreseen, Xande flipped the switch and turned Alec from a chill country with no ambitions into the more typical tyrannical cunt empire that conquers and exploits like we've come to expect from stories and history. Unfortunately, this backfired big time because Xande's experience of dying, coming back to life and all that fun stuff, changed him. After some conquesting, subjugating and killing, he realized this shit is pretty pointless and became nihilistic. Unfortunately for the whole world, he was in a position of extreme power to then act on that nihilism. But of course, we all know what happened to the Empire. It collapsed before Xande's final plan of releasing the 13th unto the Source came to fruition. Just before the 4th Umbral Calamity would claim the Elegant Empire, Emet-Selch came to recruit Amon into the ranks of Ascians to take the seat of Fandaniel, and he would inherit some of the memories of the latest Fandaniel, aka Hermes. Now this, in combination with Xande's nihilistic take on life, really messed up Amon mentally. He was traumatized by Hermes' memories, and so his mind became twisted. He began to fancy Xande's outlook on life, aka that is all pointless, and in turn, Amon was consumed by strong loathing, spite and contempt towards all life, including his own. And thus he figured the best outcome was to take the world with him. And that concludes the story of Amon. But how does it relate back to Hermes? That's what the next 2 segments are all about. We'll be discussing the parallels between Hermes and Amon, as well as going over Amon's own identity and how he tried to separate it from Hermes. Now, Amon's life parallels Hermes in dozens of ways. In fact, there are so many that I'm bound to miss some in this video, but I'll mention the stuff that stood out to me the most. I do want to say though, I love this aspect of Hermes' character a lot. Because when you go back and revisit his story, you can really start connecting all these dots about how these 2 men lived, and I think it's great. I mean, you guys know I love any story that rewards overly analyzing stuff like this. I think a great place to start is one particular comment about Hermes by Mr. Yoshida. Hermes is a character that is a bit like social media. Although it would have been best to decide the answer on his own, he can't reach a decision himself and ends up listening to many different opinions. This right here is probably the biggest character flaw of Hermes and Amon both. They really do struggle to think for themselves, or at least on those burning questions they have. When Hermes is confounded by his own society, he's determined to go ask the rest of the universe what is the meaning of life, and chooses to accept whatever answer he might get. And sure enough, when he gets his answer through Meteion, the answer being that life kinda sucks, he just accepts it and rolls with it without any further thought. And this ties into what we spoke in the earlier chapter about how he desperately molded Meteion's desire to kill everything into his "I will test mankind's right to exist now." Granted, one could say that he felt he was under pressure to make a swift decision due to the hanging threat of having to hand Meteion over, and indeed, as we established earlier, Hermes was definitely going cray-cray at that point, yet it still speaks a lot to Hermes' character that his first instinct was to blindly follow Meteion's suggestion. Such is his nature, I suppose. Now, Amon is an interesting case. Even though he too was somewhat mentally unstable due to him being traumatized by Hermes' memories, in his case there was no such time pressure. He had millennia to think it over, yet in a similar vein to Hermes, he chose the easy option of only aping someone else's philosophy and conclusions. He simply accepted Xande's view of life having no meaning and rode with it to the end. Well, almost to the end. What's beautifully tragic is that even though he was so convinced by this truth, that not only was he undeterred from his chosen course despite thousands of years passing, he painstakingly went through the effort to cause the end of the world and, actually did it, and yet, despite all that, he still falters in the end. Is this the answer I was looking for? He's still mired by uncertainty because it was never his own answer. Because just like Hermes, he lacked the courage to look for the answer within himself. Thus, there's a certain tragedy in that Amon pretty much died as he lived, confused and without an answer. Oh man, it's such a bittersweet ending, I love it. While we are on Amon's death scene, I should also note how I love the parallels to the encounter with Heidelin immediately following it. Amon talks about how to live is to suffer, and he struggles to comprehend why life is so full of misery if it's meant to be so precious. Not only is this in line with Hermes struggling to understand the meaning of life, but it serves as a counter to Heidelin's ideology and ideas of Stoicism. To add to this, on my first time through, I was pretty much laughing my ass off when Asahi showed up. I thought it was hilarious. But on further reflection, I actually find it quite fitting that it's Asahi who finishes him off, since Asahi being a fanboy of Zenos directly parallels Amon being a fanboy of Sunday. So I suppose it's meant to be kind of poetic justice that he gets to deal the finishing blow on Amon, so to speak. Anyway, the reason I said this is my favorite character flaw for Hermes as Amon is that it's so humane. You see this kind of a scenario play out all the time in the real world. In fact, given Mr. Yoshida's comment about him representing social media, I do wonder if this was some sort of deliberate social commentary on how social media has created this situation where people fervently look up to certain influencers and content creators, blindly following their opinions. Normally, I'm not a fan of trying too hard to find these kinds of messages within stories, but it's a little too on the nose with this one, so I'm suspecting that might be the case here. Some food for thought at any rate. Another way in which their lives were similar was the environment, with Elpis being an obvious parallel to Azus Ra and Eureka Orthos. Amon even created the Ixali, a bird species, in Azus Ra. Yeah, I don't know what was the deal with this guy and his bird fetish, but it seemed to persist in spite of Heidelin's kick. Similarly, the Alagans could be viewed as rather similar to the ancients, with the way they wanted to go beyond what was natural. And interestingly enough, in the Eureka Orthos questline, they bring up these parallels between the Alagans and the ancients. The Alagans too were trying their hardest to bend nature to its will through etherochemistry, just like the ancients had with creation magics. And they did so with the justification of making the following generations more resilient and therefore make the world a better place in the long term, contrasting how the ancients wanted to create perfect versions of natural beings through rather similar, though obviously a bit less cruel, methods. Though looked at a certain way, or at least how Hermes saw it, in both instances it was more a purely selfish desire, a desire to want to play God and bend nature to their will just because they could. I find it fascinating that in the Eureka Orthos storyline, this thing is even followed up on by asking the player if they felt the Alagans were justified in their experiments. While I reckon that most people's instinctual response is an immediate hell no, it's still some nice intrigue brought up by the story, especially if thought of from this angle of comparing them to the ancients. Of course, I would imagine most players would state that there is a marked difference between the ancients and the Alagans, but to Hermes as Amon, he felt similar contempt towards both groups in his respective lives. And for the final parallel, and this one is kind of obvious, much like Hermes' environment sealed the deal behind his poor mental health, so did Amon's. After all this discussion about the two being similar, we could then begin to ponder, well, if Amon is so similar to Hermes, are they basically the same person? What makes them different? I love that they explored this topic through Fandaniel in Endwalker, because ever since the reveal in Shadowbringers that individuals may share souls with their ancient counterparts, such as how we do with Azem, I was always intrigued to see this concept explored further, because it brings up this interesting question of how much free will does someone who is an ancient's fragment have? As in, are you sort of predetermined to live your life a certain way? Does this manifest itself in microscopic ways, like your favorite color or food preference? Or is it more a general thing, where a soul has kind of an imprint that determines the overall direction your life will take, but has many forked roads and branches you can take, independent of the original soul? There are of course a million questions we could ask about this concept, so I'm not going to bore you further with my musings. However, I do hope we get to explore this more in depth at some point in the game's story. Until then, however, the parallels between Hermes and Amon already give us quite a bit to chew on. Take the Warrior of Light for instance. Similar to how Amon ended up following a path similar to Hermes, we ended up following a path similar to Azem. In this regard, we are rather similar to Hermes/Amon in that we have the knowledge of whom our soul used to belong to, a piece of knowledge that very few souls in this setting are privy to. And this presents some interesting role-playing opportunities regarding how we would like to react to said knowledge and after getting to examine the case that is Hermes/Amon's lives. How does your character feel about their likeness to Azem? Perhaps they can sympathize with Amon and they hate the fact that they wound up similar to Azem, cursing the knowledge they have of their previous life and soul, and now would try their hardest to make sure they are a different person from that ancient they used to be, aka Azem. Or maybe they accept being Azem and being that kind of an adventuring spirit. There's really a lot of ways that the Warrior of Light could internalize Amon's plight and find parts of his struggle of trying his hardest to separate himself from Hermes relatable. So yes, with Amon, we get to examine an interesting case of what can happen when you inherit memories of another version of yourself. Another parallel, besides the Warrior of Light, would be Grahatia. Urianger explains in 5.3 that in order for Grahatia to merge successfully, he must recognize his past self as part of his own personality. And this is exactly what Graha succeeded in doing, which is why the merging was a success. And honestly, you could say that Fandaniel is basically what would have happened to Grahatia if he couldn't accept his past self as part of himself. Quite fittingly, through Graha's character, the game brings up an age-old philosophical question in Ultima Thule before he gets eaten by the Omicron Twitter bird, or by the Omicron Axe bird, if you will. Most of you probably remember hearing about this in philosophy class, the whole ship of Theseus thought experiment, which in the context of applying it to people, makes us question if our identities change as we age. Of course, Grahatia, the Chad he is, gives the based answer to the question, which is to not think too hard on it, and that what matters is that you are you in that moment, and that you are happy and content with who you are right now, and that's it. I also like an interpretation that the planks in the ship are our memories, which is of course very fitting to Graha's story thematically. Applying this to Amon, I believe what the game is trying to get at through this is that yes, Amon is decidedly a different person. What's more, over time, Amon did resist trying to be like his past incarnation. He fought against it really hard, in fact, and him desperately clinging to his own identity as Amon only served to further drive him insane. Tragically, however, we see in his death scene in the Itiascope that in the end, he couldn't escape his past self that yearned for an answer to the question. That was very much always a part of him, and instead of accepting it as part of his personality, he instead chose to resist it with all his might. What I like about this is that it pretty much poses a question to the player: did he die as Hermes or as Amon? It's certainly an interesting conundrum. What's also interesting here is that Amon tried to validate his own personality separate from his ancient fragment internally, whereas the Warrior of Light's uniqueness from Azem gets validated externally by the likes of Hythrodeus, Emet and Venar. We also have the case of Gaia and Logrif, where likewise Gaia being Gaia was validated externally by Reen. Personally, however, I do see it as them being two rather distinct individuals with their own paths they chose to walk. And I would even go as far as to argue that it's not like with his every incarnation, he was destined to end up walking this exact same path. I brought up Hermes and Amon's environments being similar and them being outcast in those environments because I think it's very relevant to this. What really screwed him over was that he was surrounded by people diametrically opposed to him and ones he could not connect with, in the case of Hermes, and by complete assholes in the case of Amon. Just picture Hermes meeting Azem and them taking Hermes on all sorts of wild rides around Eteris. That existential crisis would have been solved in no time. But this is why I love that they give you that dialogue option during his death scene. Next time we'll find the answer together. Not only is this bringing back around that conversation you had with Estinian in Azuzla in 5.5, but more importantly, it demonstrates that if only Amon had some actually decent people in his life. The Warrior of Light telling Amon they find the answer together is then basically giving him hope that maybe next time things might turn up differently if Amon has the correct people backing him up in his search for meaning, knowledge and answers.
Even here, even now, You have every right to hate me. For the fool I was. For the monster I became. But I will not beg forgiveness. The tale of Hermes, the man who knew so much, yet understood so little, ends here.
Alright, some concluding thoughts about Fandaniel/Hermes / Amon here. I think most people see Hermes as a pretty mid-tier character. To me, he's very reminiscent of Lise in terms of reception. Most people didn't find them to be anything special. Then you had those who really hated them, and finally a small amount of hardcore fans. Personally, I think Hermes is the biggest victim of Endwalker being so ambitious. If the whole thing had been 2 expansions, and therefore he could have been afforded more screen time, and the players could have warmed up to him more, I truly do believe he could have easily been one of the GOATs. The concept behind his story is genuinely intriguing, and all the necessary setup was there in place for him to be an exceptional character. But sadly, in the version we got, he's more of a mid-tier character and someone quite forgettable once you finish the expansion. You just aren't drawn to him and keep thinking about his story quite the same way as a character like Emet-Selch. That said, he had a role to play in the story and he filled that role. We needed a character like Hermes/Amon, someone who became way too obsessed about life's meaning and fell into despair to such a degree. He's basically a walking warning sign of what happens when you delve way too deep into these things. Something worth pointing out as well is that from what I've seen, Hermes seems to be a lot more relatable to people who has had those existential crises and or went through severe depression. As such, he didn't resonate as strongly with me personally, but I'm sure if you went through a lot of torment dealing with issues similar to Hermes, you will for sure like him. He's probably likewise also relatable to people who feel shunned by society in many ways. I think this also relates to Miss Ishikawa's comment about the AD to 20 thing. Something like Emmet's longing for his past is a much more universal thing, something that numerically more people can get easily behind. Whereas Hermes' plight is a lot more specific and as such won't resonate with as many people. It is however worth noting, and I'm just guessing here, but I assume that there might have been a difference in reception in the West and in Japan. A character who thinks separately from the prevailing mindset and being part of a collectivist society, I think applies a lot better to a Japanese audience. Now, this is not to say that Hermes is a character that you magically either dislike or love based on your region, and he's certainly not as severe a case like some other JRPG characters like I've seen in this regard. That is to say, this isn't a case like Persona 5, where the game's societal problems were specifically made to be understood by their Japanese audience. But I'm just bringing it up as a possible factor. After all, certain cultures will invariably have a different reaction to different characters. Now, an opinion I see sometimes surrounding Hermes is that he was simply a guy who had good intentions, but tragically ended up with a bad outcome for him and the world. This makes sense seeing as Venar says as much after the echo scene with Hermes and Meteion. However, something crucial to note is that Venar is working with limited knowledge. She's merely assuming that such a gentle soul wouldn't want this, and even says at the end, it wouldn't do to have such a pure soul be blackened by tragedy. I personally read Hermes a bit differently in that I didn't find his intentions to be pure. On the contrary, I felt he was acting incredibly selfish. Hermes does have this outside appearance of a gentle being, but what drives him is that selfish desire. He, in an incredible act of hypocrisy, created a being solely for his own gain and caused said being a ton of distress in the process, all without really giving a damn about anyone else's well-being, arguably not even his own. Now, don't mistake this as me disliking the character. Actually, this is exactly what I like about Hermes. This kind of a flawed thinking is so very human, and what I like about these kinds of characters. The man was acting in desperation, and understanding that layer adds a lot to the character's motive when you can get inside his head in that sense. Additionally, I said in my Venar video that her being so flawed and hypocritical is what made me appreciate her character. Only I wasn't sure if that was intentional for me to feel that way or not. However, with Hermes, we know for a fact that the writer did intend exactly that. She knew the vast majority would dislike him. Overall, from what I've come to understand, Hermes as a character has some pretty wildly mixed responses, and for most, he's easily the weakest of the major ancients we have in the FF14 story. The biggest critique I've offered about Hermes in this video is his apparent lack of screen time, and I would say that still holds. For me, he may not have been an S-tier character so to speak, but he still added great value to the story I felt. The main attraction of Hermes for me is that he's such an incredibly flawed human being, as well as the whole duality between Hermes and Amon. It's simply entertaining watching his downward spiral play out in the story, as he sinks deeper and deeper into despair, and the ending with Amon after the Ideascope I felt was incredibly satisfying and fitting to what his character was all about. That after all this time he still faltered as to what the answer was, because he never figured it out for himself, as we are then left with an open question of his fate. Will his next incarnation finally figure it out? A cynical person might say that he will forever repeat this cycle of misery with every incarnation, but perhaps a more hopeful viewer might ponder if he's going to have someone like the Warrior of Light to inspire him next time. Only time will tell in expansion 27.0, the return of Fandaniel. I'm just kidding, we'll all be dead and buried in the ground by then.
Her name is Meteion. It means shooting star.
Alright lads and lasses, we're back again with the extra bonus segment, here to talk about some symbolism surrounding Hermes' character. I should also note that I was going to talk a little bit of philosophy during this segment, but I ended up axing that idea in favor of making an entire video dedicated to the philosophy behind Endwalker. Mainly just due to the fact that there's quite a bit to cover and it spans more characters than just Hermes, so I thought it made more sense to separate it. As usual, I try to point out the obvious stuff, mixed in with some less obvious stuff, as well as my own interpretations on things. With that in mind, let's begin with the most obvious. Just like most of the major ancients, Hermes is named after an ancient Greek god. Now, Hermes is the god of many things, namely thievery and commerce, and he's also known to be basically the errand boy of the gods. The relevant reference to FF14's Hermes, though, is his role as the messenger of the gods. This basically references the fact that he sent the Meteor out so that he could hear and receive their message. There's another meaning behind his name, however, one that relates to a classic ancient Greek myth you are all no doubt familiar with, Pandoras Box. Most of you probably remember how it went, but just a very quick and condensed recap. A woman is created by the gods. She's given a box and told not to open it. She is tempted by her curiosity and opens it anyway. All of the bad shit in the world flies out and she shuts the box in a panic before hope could be released. Or alternatively, she opens the box again and then hope gets released. Okay, so how does this tie into the FF14 story? What makes this reference a bit tricky is that, as with all myths, there is a great amount of variation in the actual details behind the story. For instance, what gods gave which traits to Pandora can vary by a lot, and this includes there being quite a few different accounts as to who gave Pandora her curiosity trait. I'm pretty sure the version I heard when I was young was Zeus giving her that trait alongside the box, which makes sense as he wanted to screw over mankind from the get-go, so of course he'd create a guaranteed to fail scenario. I've also heard it being Hera who granted her curiosity and so on. Meaning, depending on the version of the myth you were told, this may not have had ringed any bells for you while playing Endwalker. However, in certain interpretations, Hermes is far more relevant to the story, and if we go with them, well, this whole thing starts to come together quite nicely. In some versions of the myth, Hermes granted Pandora a variety of things, mastery over languages, or that it was actually Hermes that named her, not Zeus or Hephaestus. But most importantly, in some versions, Hermes is the one that gave her the box itself as a gift from Zeus, and in some versions still, the curiosity trait. And it's likely that the writers went with this version as they were thinking of references to the story. So, combining all of these things, we get a really cool reference to the myth, with Hermes giving Pandoras Meteion her name, the ability to talk efficiently through dynamis, as well as her innate curiosity, which led to her unearthing all the suffering, sorrow and despair within the universe, which is the equivalent of her, opening the box, if that wasn't obvious. and also Meteion being analogous to Pandora in being nothing but a pawn in a game played by her creator. Another variation in this story is what happens after Pandora closed the box or the jar. Apparently in some retellings, she does open it a second time, which releases the final spirit, Hope, out of the box. What is worth noting is that the spirit embodying Hope was called Elpis. Yeah, a little on the nose I would say. With Meteion being Pandora, this makes a pretty obvious parallel with the scene where Emet-Selch and the Warrior of Light summon the Elpis flowers in front of Meteion. That's the equivalent of her reopening the box and finding Hope. Something worth thinking about as well. In the context of the original ancient Greek tale, why was Hope in a box full of evil spirits? There's two takes on the story that work really well with FF14 and they're compatible with one another, which is pretty awesome. The first take is that Zeus, being kind of a cunt of a god, saw Hope as an evil thing since it makes us expect something we can never have, thus prolonging our suffering and why we had been better off with Hope remaining in the box. This makes sense with the way Meteion / the Meteor view Hope, as they think it should be left in the box as it were, through them dismissing Hope and only embracing their despair. But one interpretation I really like as for why Zeus put Hope in there is that he never truly wanted to completely destroy mankind, that he felt the gift of fire, which was essentially seen as the power of the sun as granted to them by Prometheus stealing it off Mount Olympus, gave them an advantage he didn't agree with, which is why he did this whole thing with the box, to unleash all the evil in existence upon mankind. The idea being that if they can endure this trial set upon them, they would have earned their right to exist. And Hope was how he gave mankind a fighting chance to do so. Now, in this case, Zeus is a parallel to both Hermes and Vena. Vena, since she felt the ability to use fire, aka creation magics, made their lives easier and thus subjected them to all kinds of torment through the sundering but banking on mankind surviving through hope. And Hermes because in the FF14 story, he was the one who wanted to test mankind's fitness to exist and was the one who basically created the box, if you will. So basically the Hydolen/Zodiac arc is the Pandoras Box story. This may not be a huge revelation to some watching this, but I thought it made for interesting discussion since the strength behind the parallels with the myth can vary a lot based on which version you know. Out of all the allusions to ancient Greek within FF14, I think this one has to be one of the coolest, simply because it's executed so cleanly and it's one of those things where the more you think about it, the more it clicks and you just smile as you realize, oh yeah, they really were heavily inspired by this ancient tale when they wrote this story. Besides that, Hermes in the game is seen using the Caduceus, a staff with two snakes coiling around it and wings at the top. This has obviously become a very iconic piece of imagery, and it indeed originated from Hermes carrying this staff to signal him being a messenger and a traveler. Though sadly, Hermes in the game does use it right-handed. It would have been a cool detail if he'd been left-handed, since most depictions of Hermes have him holding the Caduceus in his left hand. Then again, I don't think we have many left-handed characters full stop in FF14. I also kinda wish there would have been some kind of a reference to Hermes' sandals, since not only were the winged sandals a trademark of the mythological Hermes' outfit, they are also a very iconic piece of equipment in the Final Fantasy series. It would have been funny if, say, you'd been doing the Kittisis dungeon and you just find Hermes' shoes chilling in some corner, and interacting with them gives you a minute of haste. But oh well, I guess not all things are meant to be. To add to this, Hermes using wind attacks in the game is thematically sound, since Hermes was known for his wing/feather motif, as well as being a fast boy, so there you go. Yeah man, I'm bringing up the eye colors again. Now, since Emmet's yellow eyes were autumn themed, and Vena's blue eyes water themed, Hermes' green eyes obviously refer to his wind theme. The most obvious symbolism of green is a connection to nature, which is also often the case with green eyes. This is fitting to Hermes, whose story revolves around his care for the creations of Elpis. This one is a bit of a reach, but there's also the phrase green with envy, which originates from an ancient Greek story of people with green eyes. Perhaps it refers to Hermes being envious of other people finding joy in life. But I think it's meant to simply be the whole wind and or nature theme. No deeper meaning there. Now, moving on to his constellation crystal, the Leo, or the Leo, I actually don't know how you say that. I think this one references him more as Fandaniel post-Shadowbringers, as Hermes himself isn't in the seat of Fandaniel during our visit to Elpis. In this context, the Leo personality simply refers to someone who is very theatrical, which perfectly fits Fandaniel's personality on screen. In addition, when you are picking up the constellation crystals in Amarok in 5.3, there's one constellation crystal that is different from the others. It appears to be a bit damaged, as in the lines don't quite fully draw the full constellation. That same crystal also spoke in a way that seemed somewhat incomplete. Very short phrases as opposed to full and cohesive sentences like the other crystals. The crystal in question is none other than the Leo. This offers a cool little bit of foreshadowing that something is fundamentally broken about Fandaniel, which we later come to find out are of course the memories ingrained deep within his soul as caused by Kairos. Also, the name Fandaniel really stands out from the other convocation titles, in that it's the only one that has an L suffix. In Judaism, this is commonly used for angelic names as kind of a sign of their connection to God. You'd have seen them with archangels such as Michael, Gabriel, etc. Likely this simply refers to how the seed of Fandaniel specialized in celestial currents, but a fun twisted way to look at it would be that Fandaniel did end up merging with Zodiac and dying with it, so I guess he had the closest connection to God, aka Zodiac in the end, after a fashion. Now, in my Shadowbringers analysis, I brought up during the Amarok segment how creation magics were inspired by real ancient Greek philosophy. Dynamis or dunamis, as well as energeia and entelecheia were all terms used by Aristotle. His philosophy heavily revolved around this idea of everything having some kind of a goal and an end result, its finality. To describe this evolution of what can exist to become that which does exist in its fulfilled form, he used three terms: dunamis, energeia, and entelecheia. Dunamis is the potentiality, what it has yet to be. Energeia refers to its actuality, the extent to which it has fulfilled its final cause. And entelecheia is the actualization of this potentiality. Hence, dynamis in FF14 refers to limitless potentiality. The entelechies are beings made of dynamis and can manipulate it better, hence they are how this process is realized. Some of this may not have made the most sense, since I'm giving a very TLDR version of Aristotle's thought process, but I'll leave a link to a Wikipedia page about this in the description if you want to read more about this, as I'm sure it explains it better than I did. In addition, Hermes' estimation of dynamis making up 68.3% of the energy in the universe is a reference to dark energy making up 68.3% of the mass energy of our universe in real life. Finally, I wanted to comment on the credit artwork picture. I love the imagery with Hermes and Meteion here. We see that the ancient group is exiting stage left because their part is complete, while the Scions are leaving the stage from the right side, where future scenes are typically being set up, indicating that the Scion group still has a role to play. What's really neat is that Meteion, as the Starbird, is still technically a part of the ancient group, but she's facing towards the Scions, while Hermes is giving her a farewell. It perfectly captures Meteion's transition from one group to another and indicates that she still has a role to play in the story. Awesome. To summarize everything at the end here, I feel the addition of a character like Hermes, this kind of a black sheep among the ancients, was crucial to spicing up the story of the ancients. But there has definitely been a lot of mixed feelings about the execution behind his story, so I hope this video was able to spark some fresh thoughts about the character. I'll say discussing these ancients has been a lot of fun and I'm not done yet. One ancient figure, a rather important one at that, still remains. I also want to do a little extra episode once I've concluded the series, which I'll probably discuss more at the end of the Elidibus video. So if you don't want to miss those uploads, subbing is the easiest way to be around when they drop. Till then, have a nice day.